Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Respecting the Beer. My name is Gary Arndt. With me again, as usual, is brewer extraordinaire Bobby Fleshman and historian of beer, Joel Hermansen. Now, in our last episode, we were talking about the origins of IPA and the tortured process of beer that had to sail all the way to India. Their solutions for doing it were to increase the alcohol volume and add hops. So in this episode, we kind of want to take the next chapter in IPA. So, Joel, when did this become something that wasn't just found on ships?
That's a great question. The people in England drank IPAs a bit. And I mentioned at the end of the most recent podcast that some of the early 19th century laws that the British Parliament had arrived at with as far as taxation of beers that used higher grain bills and kind of targeting the fact that the urban centers in England were having a difficult time feeding their population and that beer was, perhaps diverting some of those resources. The IPA as a style kind of vanished from the 19th century forward. And it was not widespread. It was not common. The pale ale was still common. Okay, but again, we're talking about a different style. The ABVs of a typical English pale ale at that time.
I would assume between 4 and 5% alcohol.
Yeah, these were called table beers. These were these small beers.
And as we talked about last episode, this had to do with government pressures on ingredients. Yeah.
And the fact that these beers were being taxed and, people didn't want to go into an industrial aged pub in Manchester in 1852 and pay double what you would for a small beer. So
side story to this, they were losing tax money because it was based on strength of beer.
Yeah.
And so they were losing tax money. And so then they changed that system, I think, to be based on volume. But I don't know the details, but I imagine it's all sort of entangled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there were, I think probably a small amount of IPA brewing that was still happening in England, but on a wide scale, the widespread, network of IPAs was no longer that common. So what we need to do then is kind of fast forward to where America takes the IPA, because we clearly took the handoff from the British. And in 1978, Jimmy Carter passed legislation that Gary has talked about a couple of times. If you're a repeat listener of us, and if you are, thank you. And the homebrew legislation that Carter passed in 1978, which made homebrewing legal, is really where we have to begin that conversation.
Before we get there, was one of the reasons why IPA, another reason why IPA has kind of died is that in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, the need for IPA kind of disappeared with refrigeration. You had industrial brewing. You could probably make beer now in India. You didn't need to do this.
Right.
That there was a particular problem that IPA was solving, and that problem kind of...
It might have been expense, too, and government pressures at expense of it, because the hops weren't able to be produced per acre like they are today. So I would imagine that rolled into it.
I think we can safely say all of those things contributed to the decline of IPA availability and preference in industrial England.
And England doesn't make a lot of hops. I mean, they make a lot compared to a lot of countries, but in the world stage,
their hops are gonna, you talked about this in the previous episode. Their hops are gonna be more earthy.
Oh yeah,
in their
when I taste tall mass, when it's on point, it actually does taste more earthy, and that's the intent. Yeah.
So you're looking at a period of over a century, roughly. IPA is just a kind of a niche beer, or is it?
It's dormant. I think we could call it dormant at that point. There was one brewer in the United States, and I'm going to have to go back and look this one up. We can put it in the show notes or something. But there was
Is it Ballantine?
Yes.
Ballantine, it was a vestige of the style.
Yeah.
And stopped making it sometime in the 70s. And it was that's where I was trying to get to in the last episode. I couldn't remember the name of it. Yeah.
So, again, I think dormant would be the word.
All right.
That it's
Newark,
being
New
brewed
Jersey.
in small pockets, but it's not a particularly...
So now the 70s, we legalize home brewing.
Yes.
What happens?
So, and Bobby and I were talking about this morning when we were doing some prep work for this episode. If you've done any home brewing, as Bobby and I have done, IPAs are a really natural beer for a home brewer to do. Okay, lagers are that's a different animal. You need a different level of equipment. That is not the homebrew kit that you're probably
You
starting
need
with.
5 more refrigerators and temp controllers and a very patient wife and family. Yeah,
Right.
I mean, hypothetically, you need all these things.
So lagers, not the entry point. Ales are. You can ferment an ale, at anywhere between 63 and 72 degrees, and it's going to come out pretty well. To be honest, as a home brewer, I remember some of my own early struggles. Bobby probably didn't have any struggles, but I certainly did. And sometimes
We'll do a show on that someday.
right. Oh, I would love to listen to that show. But what oftentimes happen is that you don't have a beer that's particularly well balanced. You might have a beer that has some off flavors in it, and you can kind of mask that with hops. You can add hops at the secondary fermentation stage to kind of cover some of the mistakes. So these
down south, we call it putting lipstick on a pig.
Right.
Yeah.
Perfect. So you can kind of see why homebrewers gravitated to that style, because it's a style that's, and I'll get your thoughts on this, but I think it's a style that's forgiving.
It is, but when it's like anything, to do something good is pretty easy. A lot of things anyway, but to do them great takes a lifetime, and I think IPA falls in that category, as some of the best have proven, for sure. Does it hide things? Yeah, and I've seen homebrewers and professional brewers alike misuse hops for that purpose. They're throwing money away, honestly. Right. Yeah, there's no reason to do that. Yeah.
So I think that, to me, that's always been a really important part of the story, because it's after 1978. And if you know anything about Ken Grossman from Sierra Nevada, this is part of his biography as well. And,
who unapologetically made I think it was a 40 or 35 IBU pale ale, and it blew people's minds.
Right.
Absolutely. People, first of all, said, this will never sell. This is disgusting. This is my mouth's on fire with bitterness, whatever it was. And like overnight, it became the drug of choice for every craft beer drinker in America.
Briefly explain an IBU.
Oh, it's a bitterness unit.
How does one measure?
Well, it's one part per million alpha acid, I think, by weight. And so we can measure that in all these different ways in modern times. You did do this when IPA began. We didn't have that kind of instrumentation. So they would just measure pounds per barrel and equate that to something maybe they call a bitterness unit, but it wasn't analytical. But in any case, just for context, a lager will have 10 IBUs, a pale ale will have 30, and IPA will have 50 and up, something like that.
And I think the human palate actually reaches a point where you max out. At IBUs. You get to a point where it's like you can't even.
You also saturate the liquid. So you can't get more than 100 IBUs in a liquid. And so people that say they've hit 200-300 IBUs, it can't, maybe I'm wrong, but you can't put that through a UV vis spectrometer and read that amount. It's not going to come out the other side.
Right.
Yeah.
This is the benefit of having a scientific genius sitting here. You're like a hop. You cover up some of the mistakes that we make. But Ken Grossman, coming back to this part of the story, Ken Grossman I think it was 1980, opened up a homebrew store. Much like the one, if you're from Appleton, we used to have the homebrew market over on Meade Street that I still remember going in there, and you had talked about this. I think it was on episode 1 or 2 of this podcast, but just grabbing grain and kind of chewing on grain and smelling hops, and
take me an hour to get a batch ground up.
Yeah. And those places were so much fun to go into and to hang out in, and you would meet like-minded people. And so in the 1980s, you started to see, people doing this. And for reasons that we've talked about, it's easier to brew a pale ale or an IPA. They're just, more in the wheelhouse of the common brewer, with the gear that we had, with the temperature ranges of the house and things that we had to work with. And gradually, I think that's really what, was the catalyst for this. But I think, and you and I were talking about this morning, I think maybe the primary catalyst for this is the fact that in the United States, we started to do a lot with hop hybrids and different species of hops. And,
Well,
you know,
the primary is that, like you said, Jimmy Carter made it legal. That's the big what do you call it, threshold moment in time. Yeah,
one of his greatest moments of his presidency.
Otherwise, you don't have all these thousands of would-be brewers that became the next wave of craft brewers. Yeah, but yeah, then you get into hop breeding. But a demand was only made for that after you have legalized brewing and all these little breweries opening up. They're not going to make these hops for home brewers.
Right, because just for context, there was 100 breweries. There was less than 100 in 1978.
Yeah.
And then when you look at the numbers,
and we should have mentioned, and we have many times, Anchor Brewing Company.
Oh, they're coming.
And they're okay. All right, I don't want to gloss over that one.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So all of a sudden, the amount of breweries in the United States starts to spike, particularly after we start to see, what Carter did, and then we start to see these hop hybrids. Because I feel like every time, and I haven't brewed in a while, but every time I'm, on line ordering my grain bill and getting my hops in order, et cetera, there's like a new hop out there.
Yeah, we've kind of got to a place now. It's a little out of hand, I think. At some point, it's the difference between this hop and that one are so minuscule, and your process is going to dominate the outcome anyway. There's a lot of marketing at play right now.
Right.
And there's a whole bunch going on, and that's an entire episode in of itself, all the different hop products that are coming out. But so the pendulum's definitely swung the other way. The money right now is in those sexy new hops. So they throw a lot of marketing at it, and they try to hit 10,000 brewers with the new product every week.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But and all of these hops, and like you said, we've gotten to the point where the difference is minor between them. But all of a sudden, instead of using some of the European, those noble hops,
the heirloom varieties,
right,
yeah.
Now we're starting to see Cascade
mm-hmm.
and Centennial
yeah.
and Simcoe and Chinook, which are American styles of hops.
And also garbage from the German standpoint. Cascade came out of a breeding program related to a German brewery. I can't recall which, but in any case, it ended up in America, and Coors kept it in their pilot program, and they never used it because it was garbage. And then Jack McAuliffe at
New Albion
Albion got a bale of hop leaves, and he would go. That would last him all year long. A 100-pound bale of hops, and he would cut it back, get past all the brown edges, and get to the green middle of it, and throw that into his batches as he was reinventing the American IPA. So yeah, there's a whole thing there. There's a whole story behind New Albion Brewing, as well. All California, all Bay Area.
And it also matters where these hops grow.
Yeah.
I think
you can grow Cascade in 20 different countries and get 20 different products.
Right. Like then, a lot of people are really interested right now in New Zealand style beers, and,
a lot of grapes come from there too. Mm-hmm.
Yep. And, many of the West Coast breweries are brewing with hops from
Washington,
Yakima, Washington,
yep. mm-hmm.
and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the companion, bringing this full circle, the companion to that 1978 legislation is the fact that we're also seeing this incredible surge of new hop species.
And let's not gloss over Breese Malting Company. Just 45 miles away, they became who they are today because of all of this. They decided they were going to be the maltster for the craft brewer. They weren't. It wasn't worth anyone else's time. These big maltsters, it wasn't not worth their time. They're sending rail cars to Budweiser. Why are they going to start making malts for craft brewers?
Right.
So Breese became that one of the first.
So you talked about craft brewers using hops kind of as a way to, because it's easy to use. If you're running a real brewery, though, that probably is not a problem. And so when did the professional brewers, even if they may be small brewers, start to use this, and also the demand side of the equation? Because at this point in I assume like the 1980s, everyone's drinking lager still. That's kind of what people are used to.
We're still at that age of that monolithic lager brewing.
Still the smoky in the band era.
Yeah.
I think most people, if they have an IPA and they've never had one before, it's going to be a very different experience. This is not what they're accustomed to when they think of beer. It's much more bitter. How does that transition start to happen? How does this go from craft brewing to mainstream.
Well, and I think this is where, we need to mention some of the founding fathers of this whole thing. In the
there is
past-
definitely a Mount Rushmore, isn't
Oh,
there?
there absolutely is. And
You're talking about craft brewing in general, or are you talking about IPAs?
both, but I mean, if you're talking about the Mount Rushmore of this craft beer movement, of which I think IPA has a centrality to it, which is why in the last episode Gary Arndt named it his beer of the 21st century.
Yeah.
But I think when you look at that list, if you can only put 4 people on the mountain, I'm going to give you some names, and I'm going to see if they make the mountain for you. Okay, name number 1.
There's behind the scenes people, and then there's
these are going to be kind of
I got you. Yeah,
the famous people.
Yeah.
So you can only pick 4. Okay, Charlie Papazian.
I was going to say, nailed it.
I think he has to be on the mountain.
Yeah, he's Boulder, Colorado. He founded both the Brewer Association and the American Homebrewer Association.
Right, a giant.
Every organization we have.
Right. Ken Grossman.
For sure. The Pale Ale is the best beer probably made, depending on who you ask. Yeah.
Right, and we're going to come back to that beer because I want to get your story about that beer as well. Vinny from Russian River.
No doubt. He cemented the double IPA as truly quintessentially an American style. And before that, he did the same with American IPA with Blind Pig. So, yeah, I got you. Or I should just say West Coast IPA.
So now we only have 1 spot left on the Mount Rushmore. Okay.
All right. Got a list.
Jack McAuliffe.
Yeah, that's a good one. That bale of Cascade hops.
Steve Schmidt at Bell's.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Sam from Dogfish Head.
Yep.
Like
it goes on.
There are so many gigantic figures.
Do you have Garrett Oliver on that list?
I don't.
Brooklyn Brewing.
Yeah, we definitely should. And this is kind of my point.
Yeah.
Because if we were doing this same exercise with a stout as an example, are we going to be having that list of
That's
these,
a good point. It's a good point.
These titans.
Yeah.
These
the
titans
market
of brewing.
said that it wanted IPA, and the market responded, or the brewers responded. Yeah.
So it's around this time where these titans emerge, and all of a sudden we go from 70 breweries in the United States to 1,500.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that there was demand for it. I think this is a great example in economics, what's known as Say's law. Supply creates its own demand.
Right.
Nobody knew that they wanted IPAs before this.
This is true. Yeah.
Right. What Henry Ford said, if I gave people what they wanted, they would want a faster horse.
Yeah.
That they didn't know what they want until they had it.
Quote.
Yeah.
So there had to be this process of
Yeah,
introducing people to it.
I think King Grossman did a good job. He was in the right place at the right time, and he was sort of a rebel against he was definitely a rebel against the industry, and he had his thumb right square on the pulse of where people wanted to go next. They were done with Wonder Bread. They were done with Heinz ketchup. He knew he was the beer answer to that demand.
Your first experience with Sierra Nevada Pale Ale?
My first one. It honestly wasn't that sexy. It came off a dusty shelf in an Oklahoma liquor store. But I will say, I did think, holy shit, this thing's hoppy. This thing is a lot. There's very few brewers that can make a product that can hold up to being warm and dusty on a shelf. Looking back, that was horrendous to see that. But it did, at least to my palate at the time. And it went alongside the Sam Smith Oatmeal Stout as one of my first 2 segues into craft beer. The other one was actually Arrogant Bastard from Stone Brewing Company.
Oh, yeah.
But holy cow, that's a whole other
That's a hammer
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My first experience with it, I had it on tap. I can actually.
Oh, you lucky you.
I can remember who I was talking to. I can remember the conversation. I can remember the chair I was sitting in, because it was like in Ratatouille where he eats that cheese that had been toasted or whatever, and you can see all the colors. From that day, and I can't do the math as far as years, but well past 30 years, I have not willingly drank a domesticated, lager pills since that day.
Right.
because I'm like, this is what I need to be drinking.
Yeah.
Right here.
And,
This.
and I was saying with my story in Oklahoma, nothing made it there. Like I didn't get it. There was no conduit to the outside world in
Right.
terms of craft and many other things. But yeah, it served as that for me, a conduit to what the hell was out there.
Right. It was just this revolutionary moment. And then from there, you're seeking out all of these things that they're doing out there. And I remember my good friend Christoph and I used to try to get, some of these beers from California that they were brewing out there, the Anniversary Ale. I remember when I had gotten a 6-pack of the Anniversary Ale, which kind of is the forerunner to Torpedo, I think. And I think it was 2006, and we opened this box, and it was like, when Indiana Jones takes the relic off the thing, it's like you had acquired some major thing. And we still count the days. I've actually been to some of my grocery stores, and I know you've asked about this, 2 or 3 times, wondering where's the Celebration Ale? When is it coming? And
It's connecting
we sit
with-
and we count the days.
Yeah, and it's connecting with current events now. You were talking about how the hurricane may actually delay
Yeah.
shipment this year.
Yeah.
Because they brew it on the East and West Coast.
Because we tend to get more of the Asheville,
Yeah.
Sierra Nevada line than we get the Chico stuff.
Yeah. This is turning into quite the fan show for Sierra Nevada.
Deservedly so. I mean, that because
Yeah.
we're talking about the origin of these beers, and that's really where, it's as you mentioned, it's the gateway.
Yeah, and I mean, New Albion definitely did it first, but who did it best was Ken Grossman. There's no doubt about it. He knew he had the business sense, and he got it out there. He was in the right place, right time. And I don't know him either. I've met him. I've shook his hand.
I've spoken to him on the phone.
Yeah, I know. He had a letter, but I will say, from the outside in, it looks like he may be the highest level of a perfectionist of all the brewers in all the industry. But yeah, you'll have to see his brewery to believe me, to let that sink in.
Right.
So before we wrap this up, why did IPAs start on the West Coast, and what defines a West Coast IPA versus an IPA?
Well, hops made it to, funny enough, a lot of these vineyards were hop growing fields. So the wine industry is connected to the history of hop growing in California. So mold and spider mites and so forth moved hop growing from New York State all the way across through Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, all the way into the Pacific Northwest, but even as far down into California. So there is some history with hops there even before all this happened. Because we've been brewing beer for a while. The IPA may be, especially West Coast, may be modern, but we've been brewing for a while with hops grown in the U.S. But why West Coast? There's something about San Diego. There's something about San Francisco. There's something about Portland. I don't know. I'm not the historian here as to why. I know who the people were and I know where they were. And I think it was just like-minded people. California is a little bit of its own country. And I think that it was marching to its own beat, and it had a craft phenomenon that was led by Sierra Nevada, and before that, Anchor Brewing Company, and Liberty Ale, which was an important IPA.
Yeah,
I think that Liberty Ale probably is your answer. If we're going to go to one moment, Liberty Ale was a beer that every one of these brewers grew up drinking, and I think that it broke the mold in such a way, and it gave California such an identity that all the marketing factors came together at the right time, led again by Ken Grossman and Sierra Nevada. It's the best I got. I could list a whole litany of brewers that have gone on and done great things, but I think that's the foundation.
I think at some level, I mean, when you look at San Francisco's always been prone to counterculture movements.
That's right. Yeah.
The IPA in the 1980s was the brewing equivalent of a counterculture.
Yeah, yeah. Liberty Ale was everywhere then too.
And Fritz Maytag is the one who first did this.
Yeah.
You know, when he's from the Iowa Maytags, and you know
he sold all his part of that company to open a brewery
to buy Anchor Steam Brewing and to resurrect that style, and he kind of started that.
Yeah, and it
phenomenon.
was these were Germans that owned it before he did. They were brewing, quote, German lagers in a California environment, which led to the steam beer. And he turned it into an IPA brewery as well, in addition to.
All right. Any more on the subject of IPA before we wrap it up?
I do want to ask you really quickly. So since 2011, we've seen, the West Coast IPA kind of go up and down a little bit. And you mentioned hazies a little bit. 2011 hazies kind of emerge on the scene, and they become the darling of IPAs as a style. Are you seeing that fever break at all, or are we still on the hazy train?
I think we've established that it's a style such as any other style that on its own. So IPA is so broad. There are no less than like 20 substyles. You have everything from hazy to black IPA, English IPA, double IPA, West Coast. Yeah.
Why don't we have a cliffhanger?
Yeah.
And talk about the different types of IPA.
Oh, that would be great.
On the next episode.
Let's do it.
All right. There it is.
All right. So that concludes this episode of Respecting the Beer. Make sure to subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player so you will never miss an episode. And feel free to join the Facebook group to get updates between the episodes and support the show over on Patreon. Links to both of these are in the show notes. And until next time, please remember to respect the beer.